Welcome to this Members Forum video update for 2020. I'm here in my office in Hinckley, where I spend most of my time working on 5551. 2020 has been a challenging year for the project, with changes of personnel and the appointment of Ricardo Rail as our independent assessors in our aim to obtain clearance to run on the national network. The engineers at the Princess Royal Class Locomotive Trust at West Shed have completed a full assessment of the locomotive components to hand and have provided clear advice on what we need to do to complete the locomotive to the required standards. This advice comes on the back of their years of operating large steam locomotives in the challenging and changing environment of the national network. Ricardo Rail are being fully consulted, so we are sure that this is the correct route to a successful conclusion. Some of the work we are having to undertake is quite simple, others not so, but these have to be done to achieve our aims. And then there is coronavirus. The lockdown and the social distancing rules have had an effect on progress as workshops have closed or concentrated only on essential work. Things have slowly started to return to normal, although we are now starting to see local restrictions returning in some areas, which may have further effects on the delivery of parts and our ability to visit suppliers and contractors to discuss progress and technical issues. We obviously need to keep to the central message of doing the right things to reduce any risks to ourselves and our contractors. The largest impact on our organisation is the inability to hold a Members' Day or AGM event on the scale we have in the past. The board is aware that one of the highlights from their point of view of you, our members and supporters, is a chance to get up close to our locomotive and the parts we can show you. We hope this video presentation goes some way to show the progress that we're still being made. One benefit to you is that normally you only get to see the parts that are on site at the venue we hold the event at. In this presentation we visited all major work locations so we can update you on the locomotive chassis at West Shed, the boiler at HBSS in Liverpool and the tender chassis at Leaky Finders near Exeter. I'd like to thank Gavin Shell for his camera work at HBSS and West Shed, and my partner Joe for the filming at Leaky Finders. In conclusion, stay safe and we hope we can welcome you back to our normal event next year. Okay, today we're here at Heritage Boiler Steam Services just outside Liverpool, and we'll give you a quick update as to what's going on with the boiler and progress that we're making. Major activity has been fitting all the copper stays. There's about 1,800 of these stays in the firebox. They hold the outer steel plate and the inner copper plate and support the water space and steam space between the two two plates. Stages, copper stays have been fitted, and see these ones here are fitted, but they've not yet been knobbled over and formed down to provide the steam and pressure tight seal. Below we've got one here that's just started to be formed down, so it's taken the end off, pushed it back, and if we look around the corner you can see 3 stages fitted, slightly knobbled over, and then these ones have been finished off, pressed right down to form the seal. There's 1,800 of these to do. Each one takes considerable amount of time and pressure to knock them down. Okay, on the door plate again we've got pads for all the fittings on the back end, and you can see the pipe work has been fitted internally, so that's waiting for final trimming to length, but the pipe runs inside the boiler are now in place. So these are the 2 injectors and the blower valve at the top. So a view inside the copper firebox, you can see all of the heads of the stays have all been knobbled over and flattened down. They're all completed now inside the copper firebox. Okay, this is the outside, the right hand side of the firebox. You can see all the side stays in. Up the top here, these are the transverse stays that run across the steam space above the inner firebox and hold the outer side sheets to the correct distance against the pressure that's inside the boiler. So all the transverse stays are in. They need nuts on the outside eventually just to hold them secure. The remaining holes are washout plugs. So the plug goes in there, and that gets removed to force water in to clean out the sludge from around the firebox. So these are the boiler slides. They sit on the side of the fireboxes, either side, and when the boiler is fitted into the frames, these sit on top of the slide mountings on the top of the frames to allow the boiler to expand backwards as it gets hotter and is under pressure. So the cladding for around the firebox has all been manufactured, apart from the corners, which are the real awkward bits and pieces. That's all been taken off at the moment to give access to nobble over and knock over all the stays. That's all now in secure storage, ready to go back on when the boiler is fitted to the loco. So we're here at the West Shed, and we're going to give you a run around the loco, show you what's happening, parts that are being delivered, and work that's in progress here on the build of 5551, the Unknown Warrior. So the driving axles have returned to West Shed after the replacement of the crank pins. These brand new pins inserted to correct the incorrect machining on the original one. So on the wheel set for the loco, this is the brand new set that we had made with the Stanley V pattern rim on the wheel in there. And this is the original set that came from the ATF donor, which is now returned to us from Riley's with a brand new tyre on the wheel set with the correct back-to-back measurement between the back of the flanges. The original set was out of spec and had to be replaced. Then on the main driving wheels, this is the crank axle, which you can see is being repainted by the volunteers here at West Shed. The crank web is all completed, and the spokes are now taken back to undercoat. So we're going to try and give you a walking tour around the engine. We're going to start at the front right hand corner and work our way back down to the cab, across the back, up the other side, and point out what's been going on all the way around. So the right hand cylinder, and on the floor below you can see the operating gear for the drain cocks. That's all been on and tested, and when we get around the other side you'll see it actually in place. So cylinder relief valves are mounted up temporarily. The front one is off at the moment, and the drain cock gear operates in slots in the body of the valve. The valve crosshead slides have been buffed up and cleaned up by the volunteer group here at West Shed. So they're all nice and clean and lubricated. On the lubrication itself, this is the original 8-feed lubricator that we acquired many years ago when the project first started. It's not the right pattern for the Patriot, and we're in discussions with the West Shed staff at the moment about replacing this with a 12-feed LMS-Patriot lubricator, the correct lubricator for the loco. So this is the cylinder lubricator. This is another one that we acquired in the early days of the project. Again, it's not exactly the correct type and number of feeds that were fitted to the Patriot. This is one that we acquired early on in the years of the project. The correct type is the one that's fitted up here, where it's just sitting in place at the moment. This has been borrowed from Princess Margaret Rose, just sitting a couple of roads across from here in the shed. This is the correct pattern. One of the features you can see on this lubricator are these two pipes here. This is the steam heating coil. So you can imagine putting hot steam into here, and it actually warms up the body of the lubricator, warms up the oil that's inside it. Particularly useful in winter months when the oil is very thick. You want it to flow down and lubricate the cylinder bores. That feature is not included on the original lubricator that we've got down here on the floor. So we're looking at duplicating this correct type lubricator with the heating coil in it to give us the correct lubrication features on this locomotive. The expansion links both sides and the centre engines, all three expansion links, have all been checked to make sure that the correct tolerances and end flow are in place on the bearings. A little bit of work to do on the bearings to get to the required tolerances. These are the horn guides for the axle boxes. The driving wheel sets sit here, axle boxes in the gap in the middle. And you can see that the rivets that hold them all in place have all been ground down to give clearance when the wheel set's coming in and out. There's a little bit of a fouling issue there, so they've been ground down to clear, and all of the actual box guides have been cleaned up, checked, to make sure that the fit of the boxes is correct. We're also doing and adding in the datum points so that we can check the spacings going forward on future overhauls. So I'm now standing in the pit underneath where the ash pan would be. Wouldn't normally be under here when the loco's in steam because it's not going to be a very nice environment to be in. But you can see all of the frame plates have been painted with heat reflective paint on the inside. The horn guides all cleaned up, ready for the axle boxes to come back, and lubrication pipework all in place at the back end of the loco. Moving forward, all of the vermilion has been given another coat between the frames to tidy things up and clear away all the duratus that's formed over the last couple of years. On top of the platforms you can see the 6 splashes that cover the tops of the driving wheels. They've now been finally installed. A little bit of fitting work has been required to get them to sit down correctly in the right places. You can see here that Simon has set up some of the motion work in sort of a rough position. The radius rod and the expansion link, these have been set up to check clearances against the motion brackets and just to have a good look round to make sure we're not going to have any problems with clearance. So the combination lever and the radius rod up here that we've fitted in place temporarily at the moment. These are original parts that were acquired from scrap Jubilees. We are having serious thoughts about replacing these with brand new pieces because the 2 combination levers, one appears to be slightly bent, and we're not too sure what's happened in its life, in its history. And certainly one of the radius rods has had one of the bearing holes has been drilled out, bored out and then bushed, and it's possibly causing the actual rod to be slightly weak. So once again we're looking at the possibility of replacing all these components with new. So this is the other radius rod, and you can see the hole in the centre here. This is where the die pin goes. Die blocks go in there and it pulls up and down inside the expansion link. You can see that this, at some stage in this life, this rod has been bored out and put a bronze bush in it, which has made the actual material that we've got here quite thin. So it's made the rod inherently weak. As one reason why we're investigating and having to look at replacing the complete rod. We don't want this to break in service. So left-hand cylinder, on the right-hand side of the loco we saw the cylinder relief valve, and on the floor underneath the operating gear. Here it is in place, temporarily fitted up just to check the mechanism. So these are cylinder relief valves. If we get water being compressed in the cylinder, that valve will open and release the pressure rather than blowing the covers off with a bit of luck. And these are the drain cocks, so these are what open to allow any condensate out. You see all the steam and that blowing out the front of the engine when we're moving away from the stop. This might not look too important, but in actual fact the paperwork trail is one of the most important aspects of the build of the loco. You can see that we're starting to build up numerous files on all the bits and pieces that we need to document, certificates of conformity for materials and competencies for guys doing the work, etc. So looking at some of the other parts laid around on the workshop, you can see the brass bits and pieces, oil pots, piston rod, glands, various fittings, all waiting for their turn to go onto the loco. A box of air brake fittings that Simon has acquired for us, ready for the fit. And working down the pile. Various spring components from the bogie. These are the equalising springs and a spring in the centre. More air braking equipment on the floor behind, and the 2 red painted castings on the floor here are the inner trunnions for the way shaft, the reverser shaft that goes across the loco. Okay, so we're now looking at the motion work for the engine. 2 con rods, 3 coupling rods, the inside con rod, 4th coupling rod, and the 2 outside eccentric rods. The majority of these are legacy parts. The expansion link in the middle there is for the inside engine, that's a new piece, and we've got a new inside radius rod down there as well. We've also got the bearings that go in them. These are the ones that were refurbished at Llangollen. They're all being replaced because the machining and the quality is not good enough. Probably okay to run 25 miles an hour on a preserve line, but certainly not 75 mile hours on main line. At my feet here we have the inside big end strap with one half of the bronze, the other half is safely secured away. So this is waiting to be cleaned up, ready for the time when it's ready to fit to the loco. Union links, again, there's two new and one original there. We're considering at the moment to replace the original, as we said, with the radius rods and the expansion links on the hanging on the loco at the moment. So we're looking to replace that as well to give us a new components across the loco. So these are the bogie axle boxes. These are 8F pattern, so they're actually wider than the originals that were used on the Patriot. These are 11 inches wide. The ones on the Patriot are only 10 inches wide. We're now looking at whether these are actually correct or suitable for use on the loco. So that's ongoing work at the moment. Bogie frame plates here on the floor. You see the bogie has been totally disassembled as part of the work to investigate the stresses that were found in the frame assembly. So this is now waiting for a little bit of machining work on the centre casting before it gets reassembled. On the bench here we can see a load of fittings that have been turned up by Simon and the team here at Westshed. So valve guides and drain cocks and adapters and valve crossheads, castings, and loads of material for more bits and pieces. Rear valve just cover up on the machine, just had the thread inserted for the oil adapter that goes in there. 3 of these to do, obviously one for each cylinder. Okay, main driving axle boxes, obviously 6 of these, 1 for each wheel. There's a little bit of work to be done to restore the white metal and also to get the diameter here correct against the axle diameters. Now that they've had a little bit of work done on polishing the axles. So that's scheduled to be done over the next few weeks. Delivered today, we have the component parts of the way shaft or the reverser shaft. So this fits across the loco. This piece here is the centre section, and then you've got one each side that bolts on to the outer edges. If you imagine the reverser in the cab is driving on this arm here. So that goes back to the cab with the reverser in the cab. As the driver winds that into forward gear, the whole lot rocks down on these pivots and sets the locomotive into forward gear. And if you come back up, wind it back up, they come upwards and we'll wind it into reverse gear. So that's the main way shaft. This is the inside intermediate reverser shaft, so that's for the inside engine. These 2 are for the outside engines. Also delivered today, this is the superheater header. So front end of the boiler, right at the top, this flange at the back here mounts on to the front plate, tube plate of the boiler. The main steam pipe comes into here, so steam from the regulator in the dome enters into the superheater through this hole, this cavity. In the top here is the wet header, as they call it, and then interlaced inside are various channels and passageways. And then the steam passes down through the superheater elements, back up into the bottom channel that goes across, which is the dry header, and then ultimately out of the 3 exits down to each cylinder. So the 2 outside cylinders here and the inside cylinder out of this aperture. And the final part that was delivered today is here, the boiler steady bracket. So this sits on the drag box at the back of the engine and just holds the boiler. There is a tongue piece that sits in the middle here that's mounted on the back edge of the boiler, and it just stops the boiler moving across the engine, but it allows it to slide backwards as the boiler expands. It's fitted rigidly at the smoke box end, so as the boiler expands and gets bigger, it needs somewhere to move, so that allows it to move backwards towards the rear of the loco. Okay, this is the third venue that we're visiting on this tour for you. We're down just outside Exeter at the premises of Leaky Finders to have a look at progress on the tender chassis. So this is the front end of the loco, and this is the front buffer beam. The connections to the loco are here, they'll run through, and then the cab will be running that way forward. So all the drag box is in, front buffer beam is on, all riveted in place, and all the spacer blocks are in place for the drawbars, centre drawbar and the two supplementary drawbars either side, safety bars. These areas here become the buffing plates and the intermediate buffing gear, which we'll show you a little bit later. They're all new and they're ready to be riveted in place when the time comes. So we're now at the left-hand side of the frame, at the back end. This is the trailing axle on the chassis, tender chassis. All the bits and pieces are attached, so we've got the spring hangers attached, the links come up and then the spring sits above the axle box hole here. Axle box will sit in the guides here. Guides are all riveted on and the tie bars are in place. And that's the same on all 6 axle box and wheel bearings. So these are the intermediate buffers. We saw the mounting holes on the front buffer beam a little bit earlier. This is one of the new intermediate buffers, the second one's just over here to my left. So the block and the buffer itself, there's a big spring that sits on the back end that exerts the pressure here. This rubs on the rubbing plate on the back, on the rear beam of the locomotive frame. This is one of the original blocks, you can see really corroded. So this has obviously been replaced with the new piece here. They're ready to be riveted on when the time comes. So on the floor here we can see the original spring links that were reclaimed from the 2 tenders that came from Barry. These are very worn and rusted, and some of them are cracked as well. So they're all now scrap and being replaced with new parts. So if Joe pans over towards me and looks at these bits on the bench, we can see here the new links all painted with one of the original brake hangers as well, and bearings and bushes for the brake gear all ready to go and be fitted. Okay, we're now at the back end of the tender. This is looking on the back end of the chassis. This view is normally hidden by the rear buffer beam, which is almost ready to go on. So, looking from the outside, this is one of the mounting plates for the tank. That will sit on the top here. This is the angle that goes across all the length of the frame, on the top and then down the side. These are the outside main frame plates. There's an outer spacer block that comes here that links the outer frame and the inner frame, and then all this assembly here is the rear drag box. If you imagine that all the forces from the locomotive being taken on the drawbar, taken through into the front drag box and then transmitted down the length of the tender by these 2 frame plates, outer frame to the inner frame, and at the back the forces then come through the rear drag box and out through the draw hook, which is mounted in here, and the screw coupling onto the train, and that force then exerts back into the train. We pan a little bit further to the right, you can see this is the right hand side now. The inner frame plate here, the outer frame plate there, and a void in the middle at the moment where the spacer box is going to go. And on the floor here, this is the spacer box itself, all welded up. It's been pre-drilled, it's waiting for a little bit of extra work to be done. A few rivets have to go in the right order before that box can go in, be riveted in place, and then the last thing to go on is the rear beam. So on the floor here is the rear buffer beam, all drilled and ready to go onto the chassis when the time comes. Stacked against the wall are all of our tender step assemblies, so the back plates and various top plates as well, again to be riveted in place when the time comes. These components standing up against the wall here are nothing to do with us, they're off of the 2861, which is now being used on the Night Owl 4709. So we're now inside the frames, looking forward at the front drag box. On my right here is one of the inner frames, and beyond it you can see the outer frame plate with the leading axle box opening there. The big hole in the frame plate there is for the brake shaft. That's where that mounts and runs across to the left hand frame plate here. In this void up the top here is where the brake cylinder mounts, so that sits down, and then the actual brake cylinder operating gear sits down in this area. The various holes in here are for air and water pipes to run through, and linkages to things like the injector water valves, which are mounted underneath the tank. You can see one of the spring link pins sitting there mounted inside the frame. And if I turn round, look backwards, you can see that the brake gear is started to be temporarily fitted in place just to check operation and clearances. So we've got a brake hanger, the brake pin there with the brake block will sit, and then down to the operating bar that runs across from one side of the frame to the other. And the brake pin, so you can imagine here the brake block sits on this pin, sits forward here and rubs on the tread of the wheel, which is in sort of this position here. So the pull rods are in place to transmit the load down to the three blocks. The leading hangers are in and the centre hangers are in. The rear hangers are not yet in place. And at the far end we can see the rear drag box in position. We'll go down and have a look at that in detail now. Now at the back end of the tender chassis, looking towards the back, this is the left hand inner frame plate we're looking at, outside frame plate below that, and the rear drag box in position. It's riveted in place with, you look in there, you've got the brake hanger pin in place and bush in the frame plate all there. So three rivets around it are for the doubling plate, which is on the other side of the frame, which I might be able to show you if I come up and go over the top. You can just about see that. It's a bit dark in there. Come back into the centre. And this is the front end of where the drawbar sits. Transmits the forces and the weight back into the train. And all the riveting work that's been undertaken to fit the drag box. It's a double section, so I've got this bulkhead that runs across here, and then underneath all the framework, all the rivets in place, and all those holes at the back there for mounting the rear drag beam, rear buffer beam, sorry. The last few bolts in place there waiting to be replaced with rivets, and the first of the lifeguards in place. So that's the back end rear drag box.